Welcome, investigator. Evil is on the rise. Crime is escalating. Our mission is to eliminate the crime by exposing evil, examine why it manifests, and highlight the brave souls that confront it every day. Join us as we work together to bring justice to every victim. Welcome to All Things Crime. Here's your host, Jared Bradley.
Hey guys, it's Jared. It's part 3 of my discussion with Ann Bremner and Evan Bariault about the Josh and Susan Powell case. Enjoy. Well, but when you say domestic violence, I think most people, they look at physical violence. So describe some of the other domestic violence that you're talking about.
Well, as Ann mentioned earlier, so financial, for example. So controlling finances, where you're simply indicating, okay, you can use this card at this time. You can't spend on this. You can't spend on this. I'm in control of the finances, so I have control over that. Just the emotional, right? Calling someone names, putting them down, telling them how to dress, telling them how to behave. Those are other non-physical forms of domestic violence. And those oftentimes end up being the precursors to what does end up becoming physical domestic violence. So there are multiple levels of domestic violence, and it doesn't have to be physical. And that's, that was actually kind of a big issue in our case against the state, is that the state trains all of its personnel.
Right.
It has this massive handbook on domestic violence, and it informs its personnel that there does not have to be a hitting act, a kicking act, a physical act of violence, but there's other forms. And those were all existent here in the Josh Powell, Susan Powell case. And yet the state completely ignored those things. Even when actually, Jared, you made a point about, violence towards women, violence towards mothers. And even the attorney general during the shelter care hearing, which is when the boys were pulled out of Stephen Powell's home, recognized, and he says to the court, he goes, "We don't buy Josh Powell's story about going camping in the middle of the night." And he goes, "This is the worst form of domestic violence that you could ever perpetrate on a child, is harming their mother." So the state started its case on dependency, recognizing that Josh Powell very likely killed his wife.
Right.
It's the worst form of domestic violence. And yet they continue to give Josh everything he wanted in that case, which ultimately allowed him to kill those two boys.
Wow. So just to kind of keep moving with this, and the domestic violence, helping people understand, when you manipulate the spouse or ex-spouse, if you're divorced, through the children, to me that's almost kind of the same thing. Am I correct in that?
I mean, certainly. I mean, as far as manipulating the children to have certain beliefs, I mean, Josh Powell brainwashed the boys. I mean, that is evidenced by the psychological assessments done of the boys. I mean, there's documentation that literally reads, "These boys are brainwashed." And so certainly if you have a scenario where one parent makes comments about another parent to these children, what their mother's like or what their father's like or how they should act towards them, yes, that is certainly a form of domestic violence, not only towards the other parent, but more importantly, towards the children as well.
Yeah. Anything to add, Ann?
No, I mean, I agree. And we presented in the case basically a profile of what you would see in someone where it's predictable that they're going to do these, heinous acts. And it's in addition to what Evan talked about, with these case studies, characteristics. When you look at someone like Josh Powell, he's a classic, that he's killing a family pet in front of his sister, making her touch the blood, trying to hang himself, with a rope. He had the rope marks on his neck, the knife on his mom when she asked him to do the dishes, molesting his little sister and going on and on. So, this is a guy that was well on his path, to ruin. And then once he became involved with Susan, part of that domestic violence also was he lets his dad send her pornography, photograph her, basically morph pictures to simulate that she's having some sexual contact with the dad, etc. So that's just even another piece So there's so many layers to look for in these domestic violence cases. And like she said, her most famous quote, if something happens to me, she knew
Well, I'm
something was going to
sure
happen to her.
as she was in this relationship and her father-in-law starts sending her weird stuff, and
Hmm.
the husband didn't uh,
Right.
obviously didn't defend her. I don't know what exactly happened, but
Did
to
not.
me that's just out of it. Are you kidding me? Anybody sends my wife anything, it's like it's on.
Right.
And I think most
Right.
relationships would be that way, and yet this one's the exact opposite.
Right. And that was something that was looked at by the state too, is that, that he didn't seem to protest, that his dad was doing this for years. And, that's why they moved to Utah. That's why Josh and Susan moved from Washington State, because they had lived with Stephen as newlyweds. And they moved to Utah because she wanted to get away from the creepy father-in-law.
Yeah,
Hmm.
to add to that, Jared, too, Chuck Cox went and obtained Stephen Powell's divorce file, which was actually a big part of our case. And it evidenced that Josh grew up in a home riddled with domestic violence. And, I think his father exhibited coercive control over
Right. Hmm.
Josh. And, one of the things that you look at with familicide, too, is also this idea of this loss of masculinity. And I'm sure for Josh, knowing that his father had this control over him and knowing that he couldn't do anything about the comments his father was making about his wife, the fact that he was taking pictures of her, etc., that probably rubbed Josh the wrong way. And ultimately he took it
Hmm.
out on Susan instead of addressing those issues with his father. But even after, once he moved into his father's home, after Susan went went missing, I think Stephen just continued to kind of control Josh a little bit, and that is something that had developed over Josh's whole life from when he was a
Hmm.
child. Stephen had amazing control over this family, and I really think a lot of this, as far as what happened with Josh and Susan, those boys, started with Stephen Powell.
There was a quote in the Tacoma News Tribune that said, "Never has so much evil been visited on one family by one father," and that's
Wow.
Stephen Powell.
Do you think he was one of the primary reasons that he that Josh up and moved 2 weeks after Susan went missing?
Yes. And Michael was helping Josh. We know that. And of course, you were wonderful to help, in looking at his Taurus, which potentially was involved in transporting Susan's body. But they were all, calling, texting each other, all of it. And like Evan said, Stephen had the ultimate control over all of his family. And so that's exactly why Josh moved back in with his
Yeah,
father.
that the time frame of it was really interesting because you mentioned Michael and the Taurus, and kind of we found out about that afterwards. In fact, quite a bit
Mm-hmm.
afterwards. Once we sell an MVAC system to a police agency, especially if it's an active case, they typically don't put us in the loop. But
Uh-huh.
we found that Sorensen Forensics had helped with that case, and it's unfortunate that it took so long to find the Taurus, um, even though it was supposed to be crushed. In my understanding, at least, and help me out if I miss anything, but yeah, it was supposed to be crushed.
It
It
was.
was sitting out in the
That's
Oregon
right.
deserts for a year and a half, and then once they finally recovered it and tried to use the MVAC on it, it was I remember getting phone calls, and they were kind of throwing little hints about, hey, if you had a really big surface area, how would you process it with the MVAC? And so we were trying to kind of helping them through it. But I think it's number one because of the temperatures and the time that it took to actually recover the
Hmm.
Taurus, but also um, we didn't have really refined methods back then. We were just starting in forensics, and in 2010 we were still in an 11 time frame. And I'm sorry, I've missed what day exactly. I know it's in December, but what day did Susan go missing? What
The
year though?
6th.
2009.
Okay, So 2009. So
2009.
yeah, it was barely even being tested with a forensics application back then, and so we really didn't have a whole lot of advice to give any of the agencies or crime labs on how to use it. And so maybe I'm sure it was probably used correctly, but at the same time, it's sad that I think if we had another crack at it based on our experience now, we'd probably do a little better. But anyway,
Well, you did. That was awesome what you did, and Michael, I took his deposition for a full day, and shortly after that, he killed himself. He jumped off a parking garage structure in Minneapolis. We know, we know there's involvement, right? And the fact that what you did, and it's been reported that there was some positive indication of by cadaver dog. At least that was reported. So obviously he knew
mhm.
the walls were closing in on him and took his own life, right? And so that helps us with clues as to what happened to Susan. And he didn't want that car to be found or analyzed by you. Remember, he thought it went for scrap. And so he looked on his satellite photography and saw that it wasn't scrapped, and he was astonished because it was a good car that he wanted scrapped, and that was for good
Yeah,
reason.
that was a really interesting time for us. And if you, I mean, we were, like I
Yeah.
said, so my dad that invented the MVAC actually came down with a glioblastoma
Hmm.
in 2009, and so
Oh no.
lots of crazy things were
Terrible.
happening with MVAC systems in 2009, and
Hmm.
then we're trying to field uh, questions, about potential use in the forensics application. We're focused on food safety, and at the same time dealing with the founder, having a brain tumor. So yeah, it was a weird time, and I hope that we did it justice. But more importantly, I think that
You
was just
did.
one
You definitely did.
small area where, yeah, looking at it in hindsight, it could have been a major factor. But I think just focusing again on Josh and how bizarre his actions were, um, and it's weird to me that somebody other than Susan, didn't intervene, and maybe they did, but how is it that somebody outside of the family didn't see some weird things going on?
Jared, your comment about Josh being odd, I think made it difficult for people to interact with him. I look at the case with the state, and he is so odd. He is so different, and even in his communications with social workers, I think he was just creepy. I mean, that's kind of the best way to put it. He was a rather creepy guy, and no one wanted to deal with him. So
Hmm.
even when I look at how the state handled this, the social workers were like, I don't want to deal with this guy. I don't want to communicate with this guy. He emails all the time. He's finicky. Let's just move on. Let's push this case through and get this done. And you see it in some of the emails and comments that were going on between Josh and social workers and other social workers. So instead of following their protocols, they were, hey, let's just reunite this guy with his kids so we can get it off our plate. I don't want to deal with him. He rubs me the wrong way. He makes me uncomfortable. Uh, you know, Chuck Cox had indicated that he talked to one of the social workers who had, after a visit, and she said that she was sitting in a McDonald's with him, and in her mind right then she was going, I'm sitting across from a murderer. And yet
Mm.
you you have these visits at his home which violated all their protocols, is because nobody wanted to deal with it. And my guess is Josh probably gave folks that similar vibe when he was in Utah, as far as Susan's friends and others. And they didn't want to confront him, they didn't want to say anything to him. And that's a difficult part in some of these domestic violence cases, is for friends, sometimes it is difficult to step over that line, step over that boundary, and provide that help, because you don't want to feel like you're invading your friend's space. But if you are in a situation where you see that it's gotten to a certain level, that's the best thing you can do for your friend, is to, I'm not saying confront the perpetrator, but certainly talk to them and help them get some resources instead of sitting back and just hoping things work out.
Well, and I also think, again, kind of moving back to my military days, there's everybody kind of goes through this training of an ambush, and to me, I'm thinking as you were describing even Josh's interaction with the social workers, that to me it was like was he actually trying to manipulate the social workers as well? And it kind of sounds like he was,
thousand percent. He was
yeah,
he was completely trying to manipulate them, as he was trying to manipulate everyone else.
It's one of those things where in military talk, if you're in the kill zone and they call that when an ambush is kicked off and you're literally in the kill zone, the only thing you can do is charge. I mean, you can't retreat, you can't hide, and so the only thing you have left is to get aggressive and charge. And that's one of the things where I'm wondering if there's some way, or if there's some resources out there that when women don't recognize that they're in the the real danger zone of this kind of a domestic violence and manipulation type of an atmosphere, and hopefully they're getting more and more, especially with the internet. We have the world at our fingertips.
Right.
Hopefully more and more women especially are learning about these red flags that you guys are describing. And it's just one of those where, again, to me, out of all the crimes that I have seen over the past 10, 12 years, being involved in forensics especially, to me, the most damaging to society is violence against women and kids. Mm-hmm. And it's just, and it doesn't matter if it's a sexual assault or, just abuse like what you're describing. But either way, the long-term damage, to me, like a rape or domestic violence against children, this kind of manipulation, to the long-term effects to me is bigger and more damaging than even a homicide, because it's ongoing. Mm-hmm. And generational from what you guys are describing.
Well, there was one more generation, and that was Stephen's parents. He said that he was a victim of parental kidnapping. So there you have it.
Wow. So it just goes back for multiple generations, and that's scary. So, well, anything else about this case and Josh in particular that you guys want to add?
I just want to add that we're very grateful to everyone in Utah who supported the Cox family since the very beginning. I mean, I've been in Seattle all my career, but every time I went to Utah in this case, I felt like I was just in the arms of family, of people that really, in the press and citizens and everybody else that really supported the family. So we really appreciate that. And of course, your work we appreciate immensely. And finally, I would just say that we need to find Susan. And if anybody knows anything or can help us in any way, we would surely appreciate it, because she needs to come home and be with her children, Charlie and Braden, at peace and at last.
Are there any particular websites or places you would recommend people go?
Well, there's still an active at the West Valley City Police, a link that we can send you for your listeners and viewers. And our investigator, Rosemary Winquist, is also somebody that takes tips. She was with us and presented on some of the leads and searches for Susan. And so I can send that to you as well to share. But those would be the main ones. But 35,000 pages of police reports. She's somewhere out there. And so we hope that everyone can help us find Susan. And the support is so appreciated by all of us, including our clients.
Yeah, Evan?
Well, no, I would actually just say thanks to you, Jared, for continuing to talk about this story and getting this information out there. I mean, having folks like you that have podcasts and have viewers and listeners that may have something to add. They may have information that we haven't seen before that may help find Susan or may help find other victims of violence. I mean, I think it's really important, as you mentioned, a community like CrimeCon. These are people that really have kind of an investigative nature, and sometimes maybe you go beyond your regular law enforcement avenues for investigation, and somebody may have a tip or they may have seen something. And if we can do anything we can to get that information out there, because I can tell you right now, Chuck and Judy Cox are not going to stop until they find their daughter. And myself, Ted, others on our trial team are not going to stop until we get justice for those boys. So I really appreciate you having us on here and giving us the opportunity to speak further about this case.
And I second that emotion, Jared. We both really appreciate your having us on and showcasing this case.
Oh, it's absolutely my pleasure. And I'll tell you, the whole reason for All Things Crime is not just to talk about cases in particular. You know, obviously, Susan's case has to stay in the limelight, and even though it's been over a decade, it's still one of those that people can learn from her case, and that's really what the focus of this podcast is about, is the process that you guys go through. And to me, describing some of the red flags so that somebody in the future that may be listening to this or watching this on YouTube or Rumble and say, oh my, I'm experiencing some of those red flags, and maybe they're just somebody under a lot of stress. But then on the other hand, if they have any kind of a remote background, even close to what Josh Powell had, especially with his father and grandparents, that hopefully they can avoid it and get out of those kind of situations, and or help the person get help. And to me, that's again, what's the saying that it's all the evil has to do to succeed is have good men and women not act or not do anything. And I think in this case, talking about it, getting the information out there, being able to interview guys like you that you have such an immense amount of knowledge and expertise in this, that it would just be a shame for it to not get out there more. So I can't tell you how much I appreciate you guys coming on, and I know even with the technical difficulties, it's absolutely worth it. And so believe me, I'm going to be like I was telling Evan earlier, I'm going to be on that plane to Australia editing this thing, and I want to get these episodes out as quick as I possibly can, just because this has been a fascinating and fantastic conversation. So thank you again for coming on. And
Thank you.
If you guys ever run into anything else, I'd love to have you on again.
Thanks so much for
come
having
back.
us.
Yeah.
We would indeed.
Awesome. Hey, appreciate it. You guys have a great week.
You too. Thank you.
Thanks for joining us. Your attention today brings us one step closer to exposing and eliminating the evil that brings crime to our communities. Hit subscribe and share this episode. Together, we will bring justice to every victim.